Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Rabbi Moshe Friedman. This is the FJL, Forum for Jewish Leadership, Law and Ethics Debates. I am here with some wonderful, good people who are participants of the FJL community. We're going to be doing kind of a group discussion of a very interesting topic, which is relevant today. And we're going to look at some of the sources in Jewish law surrounding some topics such as herd immunity. What are the ethical implications of suggesting that we should be able to get many people sick for the sake of some future return for society, that potentially it's better in the short run for more people to be ill in order that in the long run, more people can be immunized? That's one question. And similarly and tangentially related are other questions like governmental resource allocations. So for example, how much money should any particular government be putting into the pursuit of finding a cure or trying to curb the tide of the virus, versus all the other functions of the government that also have to be taken into account. And that also includes personal questions like, am I allowed to allocate and ration myself more resources, even if it's going to be at the expense of the greater whole? Obviously, we see people panic buying, and the question might be, is there some way of my saying, well, I have to protect myself now and maybe even in the future, even at the expense of somebody's present misfortune? So all of these questions we're going to see are going to be addressed and discussed. And so I brought a few sources for you. For those of you who are in the Zoom chat, I've sent you a source sheet. For those of you who are not, sorry, I'm just turning down. Okay. So for those of you who are in the Zoom chat, I'm going to be, I'm sorry, for those of you who are not in the Zoom chat, I'm going to be sharing my screen so that everybody has access to the sources. Okay, so basic format is I'm going to present the source. I'd like to get your thoughts on what you think the source suggests, if there's any application to the source, for the source to relevant issues, and if you agree or disagree. Before we get started on the actual sources, I'm just going to ask you now, just kind of outright, does anyone have a particular point of view on some of these subjects? Let's leave kind of panic buying out of it, because I think that tends to get more personal and more heated. But let me ask you, I'll throw it out to the floor. Imagine if there was a strategy that was, I don't know if it's still being implemented or not, but imagine if there was a strategy where we said, right now, in the short run, we need to get more people ill so that in the long run, fewer people can get sick overall. Or right now, we need to allocate more of our budget to future prevention, even if it means that right now we're going to have a bit more problems. Anyone have any paradigm or way of looking at that moral dilemma?
I think one of the biggest complications for the idea of herd immunity at the moment.
Who is that? Emily. Hi.
Yes, it's me. Hi. Is that right now we don't understand a lot of different details about the virus, how it mutates, how it can develop. And so there's the added moral issue of there is no guarantee that if we allow short-term pain and suffering, that there will be long-term benefits.
Okay, so there's certainly no question that the issue becomes more complicated due to our insufficient information about whether that would actually work, right? So let's start with the philosophically easier question and say, let's say that we could assume that right now I can take a certain amount of the budget that would otherwise go to hospital beds and ventilators right now, and instead redirect that amount of budget towards finding a vaccine or implementing some sort of longer term strategy for curbing the virus.
I think the other kind of paradigm you got to look at it through is what's like the government for, and ultimately, a government is not the government of a landmass; it's a government of people, and especially, or at least in democratic countries, it is elected by those people to serve those people's interests. And if you look at it through that way, then the government is responsible for taking care of the immediate interests of the people, which at its most fundamental is making sure they stay alive. All governments will always say that national security is kind of like the fundamental thing, keeping people safe. This is the same thing, just a different threat. And therefore, through that prism, I think the important thing is keeping people alive in here and now. And if that means finding a vaccine takes longer, then so be it, because they are fulfilling their ultimate obligation.
Okay, so Andrew, you're suggesting that there is we have to look at the role of government and what the government is here for, and you're suggesting that the primary role of the government is responding to the needs of the people who make up that society, and whatever the most immediate needs are, those are the needs that we have to address. Anyone else want to suggest something?
Yeah, I think with the responsibilities, it differs depending on who the actor is. So if you've got a government, they have a collective responsibility, whereas as an individual, you have an individual responsibility, and they might be different things. So we each individually have a responsibility to keep ourselves safe and perhaps our individual families safe. The government can't care about each of us individually, and it would be misplacing resources to pretend that it was caring about individuals. It has to look after a system, because that is, at the end of the day, the system of government. It's not a personality.
Okay, great. I'm glad that Andrew and Daniel, you guys have kind of brought these two perspectives to light, because I think that's the perfect introduction to the sources that we're going to discuss. And I think we're going to see that there is a tension here between the individual responsibility versus the societal responsibility, and whether and how that differs when we talk about short-term and long-term planning. So I'm now going to move over to the first source. I'm going to share my screen right now for those who want to follow along. Okay, and the first source is going to be from the Talmud Bavli. For those of you unaware, the Talmud is the main body of work of the oral Torah that we have, which is the rabbinic tradition, which it itself, according to Jewish belief, is tantamount in its level of authority to the Torah itself. And so we have to understand these sources as being, as if they are Jewish binding perspectives. Now, that might be a little bit confusing, because what we're going to see is there are actually going to be conflicting opinions within that body. So this, in a certain sense, frames the realm of discussion around which we can say that these are the opinions that are the valid Jewish opinions. Now, that doesn't mean that there are no other valid opinions outside of the Jewish ones, but if we're going to have a kind of a discussion around what is the Jewish perspective around all this, this is the kind of the clay from which we can work. So the Talmud Bavli, I want to start from the beginning here. Before we get to societal needs, I want to talk about the where we see that there's a need to save lives in general. So the Talmud Bavli in Sanhedrin 73a, from where do we know that one who sees another drowning in a river, or being dragged away by a wild animal, or being attacked by bandits, is obligated to save that person? The verse states, you shall restore it, the lost object, to him. In other words, there's a verse that's referring to lost objects, and it's phrased in a way that it can be understood somewhat ambiguously. You return it to him. Now, it can mean not only the lost object, but it can also mean him. So therefore, the rabbis learn out from the fact that this sentence was phrased in that way, that it's referring not only to returning lost objects, but even to returning lost bodies or lives. If you see somebody's life that's about to go, you have to save it. Now, as an aside, I will say that there is another verse in the Torah that says explicitly you have to save somebody's life. Do not stand on the blood of your brother, right? Al ta'amod of your friend. Al dam re'echa. Do not stand on the blood of your friend. So you may ask, why do we need a source which kind of learns indirectly from restoring a lost object also to teach me that you need to save somebody's life? That's an interesting discussion. It has to do with adding another element about whether or not you would have to spend money to save somebody's life. But in any case, we certainly see that a person can be held accountable morally for standing by and letting somebody die. So it may not be, right? It may not be enforced by a human court. In other words, I remember that several years ago in the United States, there was something called the Samaritan laws that were passed, where actually a person could get convicted if it was proven that they stood idly by a crime and didn't do anything. I don't know if we would go that far, but certainly one's own moral and religious obligation with regards to some higher power, they would be held accountable for not stepping in to do that. Now, before we just start the banter here, I'm just bringing these sources as a little bit of background information. I'm going to go now to the next source, which is now going to be throw a little bit of a spanner in the works. It's easy to question, do you have to save somebody's life? Do you have to save somebody's life? All things being equal, there's somebody drowning, you're a good swimmer, there's no question. You gotta save them, right? Now we're gonna ask a question, well, what if there's a question of me or him or her? What if it has to do with, well, am I putting myself at risk by saving somebody else's life? So the most famous source that we have on this, which I'm gonna show again now, is a source by Rabbi Akiva, famous Rabbi Akiva, in 62a in the Talmud as well. Two people are walking on a desolate path, and there was one jug of water in the possession of one of them. So one of them has the jug of water. And the situation was such that if both drink from the jug, both will die, as there is not enough water. But if only one of them drinks, that person will reach a settled area. Okay, there is now a dispute, okay? Two opinions regarding this case. You've got the water, you're in a deserted place. You can see for a few miles off, there is a city, but you're so parched that if you were to split the water, you'd both die. But if you yourself drank the water, you would live. Said Ben Petora, it is preferable that both of them drink and die, and let neither of them see the death of the other. Ben Petora says it's unconscionable that I would be able to allow myself to live and cause the other person to die. And the Gemara says this was the accepted opinion until Rabbi Akiva came and taught that the verse states, and your brother shall live with you. V'chai achicha imecha. Your brother will live with you. The with you indicates that first you live, and then your sibling will live with you, which implies that your life takes precedence over the life of the other, which from here we see an incredible moral injunction, which is that all things being equal, if you are the owner of the flask of water, you're not permitted to relinquish that water in order to save somebody else's life. You have a moral responsibility to saving yourself first before you can save somebody else's life. Now, there are going to be all sorts of interesting, special cases like that, such as somebody in the army or other examples like that. But for the most part, you as an individual have to save your life first. So now, once we've seen these two sources, I want to ask you, what can we infer from the present situation? What would that tell me about, can I apply that to myself? Can I apply that to the government? What would you say this allows me Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi guys, can you hear me? Okay, great, we're back. So the computer froze and I had to restart. Good, now that we've taken care of that. All right, so any thoughts about this last source here that refers to I have the right and I actually have the obligation, according to Rabbi Akiva, to save myself first before somebody else? Is this applicable in any of our questions, whether it's regarding panic buying, whether it's regarding allocating resources or anything like that? What do you suggest?
I think, the place that it's most applicable is as far as resources, as far as people buying stock for themselves. However, there is a very clear line between buying what is essential to keep yourself alive and buying more than you need at someone else's expense. So I think, yeah, it's fair to say, if there is one roll of loo roll left and you own it and someone else needs it, it's arguable that that piece of Talmud argues that you can keep your piece of loo roll, but it doesn't argue that you can buy 10 when you don't need them and not help others. Okay, good. So Emily is pointing out something very important, which is number one, so far this source has told me nothing about projecting into the long term. I don't know anything about saying, well, I've got enough, I'm not going to die right now, but I need to hold on to my water in case I get that you do have to take care of people's immediate needs first. I have to look out for my own well-being right now, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I can hoard future resources.
I also think.
Anyone else want to add anything?
Yeah, I also think there's I guess it's a false comparison with the source because
Daniel?
Oh,
that one's Andrew.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Oh, it's just Moshe.
Have we got Moshe?
Have we lost him again?
I think he's
I think
frozen.
he's gone.
Oh,
Oh, he's back.
Oh, hello.
Moshe?
No, frozen. What were you saying, Andrew?
I was going to say.
Okay, Andrew, we're with you. Go for it.
I was going to say, I think it's a bit of a false comparison because in the source, they're both going to die, or you can save one. Whereas in terms of, I'm not even talking about panic buying, just in terms of behavior, sort of over the coming weeks and months, if you kind of isolate yourself and you don't go out, then you can both save yourself and the people at risk. So it's not a choice of only one person will survive. It's by your actions, you can save two people, both yourself and the unknown, invisible, at-risk person who you're never gonna meet. And so I kind of get why this might be applicable, but at the moment, it's not a zero-sum game. And so I think we are in a situation where, yes, you look out for the people, but you look out for the people by looking out for yourself. Yeah.
Okay.
I think somewhere where it can apply though, more so than some of the more trivial sides of the way people are behaving at the moment, is if somebody in your household has it, you're then torn between those sort of two desires. One, to support them and care for them and look after them, and the other is, we've all been told, no, if somebody in your household has it, you need to put them in their room, close that door and leave them be, because you've now got to protect yourself. So in that situation, it then is more similar to the original source story.
Yeah, it reminds me of always the instruction in an airplane that if the oxygen mask comes down, you have to first put it on yourself before you put it on your child, right? you almost can't save other people until you can save yourself. That's definitely true. That's definitely true. Now, where this becomes interesting to me is there's, in addition to what we've already said before about, the distinction between saving lives and, you know, we don't normally have to decide who lives and who dies. But Emily made one distinction. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Emily made one distinction, which is that this doesn't help me project into the long term. So from a governmental, societal point of view, it's very difficult for me to say, oh, well, I'm allowed to stock up resources now in order to save somebody at the expense of somebody else. The other issue which makes this difficult to apply is that we're discussing specifically about a case where one person owns the water and the other person does not, right? And so already that person is not allowed to relinquish the water. But what happens if the water is from a third party? What happens if I'm a third person who's totally healthy and I happen upon two people starving in the desert of thirst? Now, what do you guys think? What should I do? Should I split the water like Ben Patora says, so that they can both live marginally longer, even though they might both die? Or am I obligated to choose one person and let that person live? That becomes an infinitely more difficult question.
Well, there's a line somewhere about he who saves one man has saved the whole world.
Okay.
So I don't know if that's on intention or impact. So if it's on intention, then it doesn't matter. If it's on impact, then it's much better to definitely save one person.
Okay. Good. So Daniel, you're looking at kind of consequences versus the morality of the act itself. It might be an incredibly difficult act to say, I'm only going to choose one person, the other person has to die, so that one person can live forever instead of both of you only live the next, 20 minutes.
On the other side of Daniel's coin, though, does that count as you killing somebody if you actively don't give them water, knowing that they're going to die? Or is it, I don't know, if it is considered as killing someone, then I think it's a different, the discussion gets that bit harder as well.
Surely, though, it would only count as killing someone if giving them, because you have a commandment to take care of your body. You also have a commandment to help others, but so you couldn't give them all the water. So splitting the water, they're still going to die. So you're not standing by and, does that make sense? You're not murdering them because to murder them would be to stand back when you could save their life.
Right. This gets into a lot of the big kind of trolley experiment questions that philosophers deal with, is what counts as an act of killing and things like that. And, there are a lot that's dealt with that, but I think that on any level we can understand this from a very, very simple point of view, in the sense that any time, let's say you're a first year medical student and somebody comes to you and says, hey man, you should just go out and be a paramedic. You could be saving lives right now. And you say, well, that's great, but I could be saving many more lives and much qualitatively be more effective if I stay in schooling for another several years, so that I can be a full-fledged doctor, right? So we're always making that decision. And if you want to say that withholding my help right now means that I'm murdering people, well, that's a very, very difficult thing to say, right? But the reason why this question becomes important is because that is now a much more applicable question to our case right now. If the government is the third person who encounters two people in the desert who are both dying of thirst and says, well, I have two options. I can either give all the water to one person, or I can give a lot of little bits of water to many people. So you can definitely imagine cases where that might be the case. I can either spend a lot of money right now buying more hospital beds, intubators, all those things that are going to, prolong people's lives right now. But it may, on the whole, result in more people dying over the long run. Or I can prolong, I can withhold some of that money, withhold some of that support in the short run, and instead I can invest it so that more people will live longer in the long run. You see what I'm saying? So the answer to this question is a very significant one. Very, very significant. Anyone else have any other thoughts? So far we've had Andrew, Emily, and Daniel representing all 11 of you guys here. Anyone else have any independent thoughts that they want to share? Okay, I'm not going to force anyone. Oh. No one? Okay, fine. So with that said, I want to move on to the next source. So, bring up here. Different Talmud Bavli, Vidarim ADB. This is a very interesting source. In the case of a spring belonging to the residents of a city, if the water was needed for their own lives, i.e. the city's residents required the spring for drinking water, and it was also needed for the lives of others. So let's say there's a spring at the top of the mountain, the water trickles down, and the first town that gets it towards the top of the mountain, they get first dibs to that spring. But there's a town further down the mountain that also needs the water for drinking, okay? So if it was a choice between the first town and the second town, the first town takes precedence, just as we said by Rabbi Akiva. Likewise, if the water was needed for their own animals and also for the animals of others, their own animals take precedence over the animals of others. So in a similar vein, not only do I look after myself before I look after other people, I also look after my own property and my own animals before I look after other people's animals. And if the water was needed for their own laundry and also for the laundry of others, their own laundry takes precedence. However, if the spring water was needed for the lives of others and their own laundry, the lives of others take precedence over their own laundry. So if I had only enough water to launder my clothing versus allowing the town below me to drink, say the rabbis, you allow the town to drink. Now that sounds obvious enough until you read the next opinion. Rabbi Yossi disagrees and says, even their own laundry takes precedence over the lives of others. As Shmuel said, grime on one's head leads to blindness, but grime on one's clothes leads to madness. So there was a particular, so now, whether or not the science here is good, I want to kind of ignore that. Although there are modern doctors that have suggested that there was a certain type of worms. I think it was maybe a meningital worm that lives on clothes and not on human skin, which can lead to some neurological dysfunction. It's very interesting. There is something that could be like that. Now, if we take this at face value, it suggests that if I have access to the water first, I can forego great pain, discomfort, or harm, even at the expense of the lives of other people. However, almost all of the commentaries on the Talmud say that that's not how we're meant to read it. So what I'm going to do now is, before we discuss this source, I'm going to show you one of the prevalent commentaries on this teaching, which is by the Chazan Yecheskel, Rabbi Yecheskel Abramsky, from the early 20th century. So he says the following: the residents of the city are permitted to withhold their water and prevent it from being used by another city until the first city is drunk first. As it says, your brother will live with you. That's what we first saw. Your life comes before the life of others. And once the first city has drunk, if there is still enough water either to feed their cattle or to provide water to another city, then the lives of the second city comes before the cattle, i.e. the second city required to drink the water to satiation. Okay. But were they not given access to this water, they would not have died, since they already had just enough water to stave off thirst. So here's the important part, is that what Rabbi Abramsky here is suggesting is that you cannot read literally that we're sacrificing the lives of the people from the second town, but rather it's a question of whether they have just the bare minimum of water to stay alive versus enough water to be comfortable and to drink to satiation. In that case, the rabbis say, better that the second town drinks to satiation and instead you have dirty clothes, even though those dirty clothes may mean that you come to, you may run the risk of being in danger or harm. Says the Chazon Yecheskel, in such a case, Rabbi Yossi argues and says that the first city's animals come before the city of the second city. Okay, the rabbis say that the people of the other city come before the first city's need to launder, even if they have enough resource to stave off thirst. Nonetheless, their ability to drink to satiation supersedes the first city's ability to launder clothing. In this case, Rabbi Yossi argues also and reasons that their laundering supersedes the people of the second city. And even though there's no consideration of monetary loss or the prohibition of causing pain to animals, as in the previous case of one's cattle, however, there is the consideration of physical bodily pain when one is unable to launder clothes, and therefore their laundering supersedes the satiation of the second city. So just to be clear here, what that suggesting is that it's not only the case. Now we're getting into triaging not just life for life, but what about my discomfort and pain for the for the extreme, for maybe somebody else's discomfort and even possible risk of danger. Now it seems to be triaging those and saying, I can, according to Rabbi Yossi, I can even place my own discomfort at risk when it's in the face of the greater discomfort of a larger group of people. What do you guys say to that? Any reflections or thoughts on that? Is everyone clear what the suggestion, what the implication of this Talmudic passage is saying? Should I make it a little bit more clear?
Well, it sounds to me more like modern utilitarianism.
So explain.
That it's the greater good seems to trump the individual good, so long as you can put certain things in a hierarchy. So an individual life still trumps the greater good of washing clothes, but once it's, you can sort of put it's like a pyramid where, or more like one of those what they call the cross diagrams, where you've got the different things going across, and you're like, this one trumps this one, but this would then not trump this, and then you go across the some sort of grid. But it seems like it's utilitarianism with the added caveat of this one trumps this one.
Okay. So so that's interesting though, because so what would the equation here be? What, according to Rabbi Yossi here, who says that you're allowed to launder your clothing at the expense of giving the second town enough water to drink comfortably, what trumps what? Let's just make it very, very clear. What is the equation?
It seems that in this case, comfort seems to be of a lower category than something which is purely for providing requirements. But my town's comfort comes before your town's comfort.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Anyone else want to weigh in? I think it's worth it maybe just to make it a little bit more clear here, because I think, Daniel, actually what it's saying is the opposite, right? Is that what we're weighing here is there's one group of people who are in desperate need and may run the risk of potential even death, right? if I don't permit another city to have plentiful water to drink, what we're telling people is that they're only allowed to subsist on the bare minimum, which is a very not simple situation. But the massive, novelty of Rabbi Yossi's opinion here is that it's not just comfort. There's some sort of, serious potential risk of harm that comes with not laundering your clothing, right? Some neurological disease here that will lead to what they call madness, this disease called madness, okay? What we're suggesting here is that when it comes to the needs of this first town, we can say my future risk is now going to come I'm going to account for my future risk at the expense of another town's present difficulties, real, very present pain and perhaps danger. Now that's a very interesting thing, because what we're now suggesting in this passage is that I can plan for the long run when it comes to looking at my societal needs, which is a massive precedent. Yeah.
Does this also raise the question of like what it is to kind of like be alive and have a life? Because if kind of sort of saving human life is the most important thing, then you think it's quite simple that you save the second town. But if this is sort of implicitly suggesting that it's not just about being physically alive, it's being able to live a life, which madness would obviously impede on, then the suggestion is do you have to save a full life as opposed to like someone living with whatever issues may come in the future?
Yeah, now that's an awesome point, because if you think about this, governments have to deal with that question all the time. I have a certain budget, and any budget that I allocate to the arts or to parks or to culture, right, is budget that I'm taking away from directly feeding the poor and housing the homeless and preventing and not putting more police officers on the street or whatever it is that you could imagine that would directly and immediately save lives. And so you could ask that one could theoretically say, the government's accountable for all those lives. You should be saving lives as much as you can before you think about any, endowment for opera music. But alas, we see that that's not how society chooses to look at itself. We say that there's an overall quality of life that has to be preserved that may sometimes supersede actually just trying to put out fires and saving lives in the short run. Now that's an amazing thought, but it's something that if you think about it, everyone lives in a society like that. So it's not such a huge novel idea.
But I would argue that is quite novel. That's quite modern. In terms of when we're asking what is a state for, what's a government for, it breaches more into political theory, I suppose. But this idea that a government is there to provide us with opera is very modern. It used to be that wealthy people might offer patronages to these things that they saw as adding value to their lives and the lives of those around them. But it wasn't the role of a government to provide that. That seems to be something which is very much to the latter half of 20th century and 21st century.
Okay, so very interesting. Again, Daniel's bringing us back to this kind of wider political theory question, which is what's a government for? Do we say that does a government exist to kind of overall enhance the quality of life? Or if we go back to kind of, feudal arrangements, it was basically, I'll just make sure that you don't die, right? That's essentially what the social contract was. You work for me and you won't die.
I think something else that's really interesting and also quite to some counterintuitive, I guess, is this leveling of the hierarchy of needs, of saying that the need to have clean clothes is as important as the need for life, for water, and that you can, if all those needs are equal, then if the water is yours, prioritize your needs. But I think there are a lot of people who would argue that there is a basic, the need for water to live is a greater need than the need for clean clothes. And so once everyone in your village has that basic need, you help with that basic need with other people before the next level up of needs. I think that's interesting.
So so would you disagree with this source? You would say, I agree with the first opinion, which is that no, if I only have enough water to choose between my laundering and the other town's subsistence water, then you go with that.
Then yeah, I think subsistence is a more basic need and therefore a greater need.
Right. So I want to now share with you a thought that's source number 5 on our source sheet, which tries to make a distinction here, which could be illuminating, at least in the context of our discussion. If you look at source number 5, which is I apologize, it's a secondary source. I was trying to find the original source for this, but I can only find somebody who kind of quotes it or at least alludes to it. There was a rabbi named Rabbi Moshe Tendler who dealt with questions like this, and he was disturbed, as Emily is, I think, by the conclusion of this Gemara. Why should the community not be required to share its water in order to save the neighboring community at immediate risk? He explains that a community is different from an individual because it is required to consider future risks. Apparently, the doctrine of before you, right? In other words, when we saw the operating principle of Rabbi Akiva, your brother lives, with you, applies differently to an individual than a community. An individual is required to do whatever is in his or her power to save a person at immediate risk. A community, however, is required to think in broader terms, either because the future needs of its own citizens take precedence over the immediate needs of another community's citizens, or because when dealing with a community, the principle of before you, in other words, who do I look at as before me? Who's in front of me now? When I say I have to treat the people who are in front of me, is that only the people right now, or maybe the people 5 years from now? That should maybe be interpreted more broadly. And he alludes to some other ruling about autopsies. Jewish law requires the leaders of society to take into account future needs when allocating resources. Now, I'll put as an addendum to this that I want to juxtapose this to something that we said earlier. When we spoke about the 2 people in the desert, and I asked you, what would happen if you had a third party who is distributing water? And should they give all the water to one person so that they can live for a very long time? Or should they distribute the water so that both of them can at least live another 20 minutes? So there is an opinion of a late 19th century rabbi from Lithuania, Rabbi Chaim Ozer Grudzinski, who wrote in a book called the Achiezer, who suggests that the reason that if you go back to the earlier source there, I believe it's source number 2, right? He said we had 2 conflicting opinions. We had this guy named Ben Petura who said you should both split the water, and Rabbi Akiva said no, you keep the water. And the Achiezer here suggests that the only distinction is whether they consider the ownership of the water to be salient. According to Rabbi Akiva, because you own the water, you have to drink it first. The way the Achiezer interprets that Gemara, though, Ben Petura is suggesting that your ownership of the water does not matter at all, and therefore you have an obligation to share it with somebody. According to this, says the Achiezer, if I'm a third party and I own the water and neither of the 2 people in need own the water, then I, the third party, have an obligation to split it, just like Ben Petura. In which case, there's now an interesting juxtaposition. As an individual, it may be that I have a necessity, a moral obligation to just try to save as many people as possible who are in front of me right now. But it could be that as a community, which is something that exists greater than any one individual, I have to think about the long-term needs of that community. And in that case, my moral obligations may change in the sense that I now have an obligation to look at the longer term of society. Because it's one thing to say that if I'm treating individuals, so individuals may live and die, but if I allow the entire society to die at the expense of the short term of the society, then I've basically made that entire society extinct. So that seems to be there. So going back to what a bunch of you said, Daniel, you in particular, it appears that from a societal point of view, we may take a more utilitarian perspective than if we were making decisions based on the individual. And my read into this is the reason why is because at the individual level, I can afford to be a deontologist. I can afford to look at the moral weight of the actions and not the consequences. But when I'm dealing with society-wide problems, what are you going to say? Well, I can go to the grave along with the other millions of people in society, at least knowing that I made a moral, a good decision, even if it didn't lead to the right outcome. That's what I think this Rabbi Tendler is saying. So now I want to open it up to you. I want to know what your thoughts are. Do you agree with this distinction between individual and society? Do you disagree? Go for it.
I have quite a big problem with it, because obviously this crisis sort of really highlights, I guess, the different approaches that you can take. But if you take it to its fundamentals and even look at long-term consequences, then you could say, okay, the government in future 10, 20, 30 years will only ever be utilitarian and will therefore not care for the people who have been left behind by the system, whether that is like the poor or the homeless. And obviously now we have like a real decision to make. It's in the news, but over like the long term, governments still look after, well or badly, they still look after the people who have been left behind. And no one is advocating for almost like eugenics of, well, if you've not found the job to earn enough money to live, then so be it. We don't need you in the state or the nation. And I think obviously in sort of coronavirus society, yes, it's a pertinent question, but if you take the source as it is and sort of apply it to life, then you've got to apply it all the time. And if you apply it all the time, then there's some like serious moral, I have serious moral objections to essentially being like, well, if you've not made it, the government's not there for you, because that's, I think, what they're there for.
Okay, Andrew, a valid distinction. I will say one thing though, just to kind of clarify, just to make sure that we're on the same page here with the source, is that if you go back to source 4, we're not discussing in the internal needs of that first town. In other words, within the town, within that first town, they're weighing, they all have subsistence water, and now they're wondering, can I launder, right? Their question is, I think it would be a more relevant example if we said, do I have to wait, if I'm a wealthy first world country, and then what's my obligation to give aid to another country, right? Something like that. I don't think that this source would be advocating that there are certain privileged few within the society, and we're going to look after them at the expense of other people in society. And in addition, let's just make it very, very practical for us. What's the question we're asking? Are we saying, let's save the rich at the expense of the poor? Well, that may de facto be what's happening if you try to, impose herd immunity, and we can discuss that, right? But I think what we're actually trying to say is we're looking at the entire body of civilization, of our society. And the only question we're trying to figure out is, do I save some now or more later? But it's all the same group of people. So I don't think we're trying to take one segment of society and say that they're more privileged over another segment of society. And in that category, I think that's what we're trying to ask. Can I be more utilitarian in that respect? Where I say I have, 15 million people. I can either save, 4 million people now or 10 million people in the long run. What do I do?
I think there's also a point to be made about the role of global society as opposed to national society, as opposed to citywide society, as opposed to a smaller street society. And so we've got these communities at all different levels. Really, we're talking about something which nobody actually owns. So when we're talking about ownership, even with the example of water, which we talk about having owned the water, owning water is a very modern concept, because until fairly recently, you didn't bottle water and sell bottled water. It's an absurd idea. So the fact that we can now own water, which is a fluid that runs through Earth, so it's something that you couldn't possibly logically own, in the same way that you can't, arguably, you can't own good health, in the way that when we're talking about bringing it back to coronavirus, you can do your best to prevent and you can do your best to support, but you can't own good health, and you don't own coronavirus either, unless it's been sort of biologically made in a lab, in which case then somebody owns it. But as a natural virus, you don't own it. It's something which can't be owned.
So, okay, good. So that's an important thing to understand. So what, therefore, would you suggest? Does that make this less relevant or more relevant in the context of what we're discussing? Does that mean that, you know, can I own do I own a vaccine, or do I own the resources to be able to help people in my society versus helping people in other societies? And again, I'm trying to bring this more and more back to something that's salient for us right now, which is we're not necessarily triaging different groups of people. We're not even talking about, do I give aid to Italy or do I give aid to the United Kingdom first? What we're really saying is, you know, should I withhold some resources now from my population in order that I can maybe save more people later? Am I allowed to do that? Or do I have to say I have to treat the people in front of me now? Whoever is most urgent right now, that's where I have to put all of my resources. Any thoughts?
I think, you know, as we've been saying, there's a lot of the sources we're looking at are talking about an immediate problem, a problem that can be solved immediately by one person, for example, drinking the water or not, in the first example. The idea of looking long-term at future lives that you are saving, I think is something beyond the application of the sources. I think, you know, the idea that Daniel brought up earlier, which is, you know, he who has saved one life is as though he has saved many, I heard being applied by Rabbi Tatz the other day, to this idea of isolation, of if you isolate yourself, you have no idea how many lives you are saving. And that's looking long term. That's saying, you know, there are future effects of me staying in right now. Arguably, in that case, whichever will save more lives in the long run is the route that we should be taking. So developing a vaccine long term.
Right.
As a side note, the other thing Daniel said of kind of briefly brought up of where do we put limits on our society? You know, it's a social construct to say Britain is a society or London is a society. Our countries are constructs, and so to mark out, okay, well, we're going to help just the people who were born within this section of the planet is quite a lot of levels problematic.
Yeah. Okay. So without getting into you know, theories of you know, of the construct of societies, I agree with most of what you're saying. I want to end this, because it's now 2 o'clock, with the final source, which I think may kind of just shed just a little bit more light in terms of how we look at, you know, triaging, you know, present versus future considerations. And if you just look with me, on the last source, which I'm going to share on my screen for those who want to see it. For more valuable as workers in the marketplace because of tikkun olam, benefit of society. The Gemara asks, is tikkun olam the benefit of society referring to pressure on the community, i.e. once they pay a large ransom, the kidnappers will continue to increase their asking prices? Or is that kidnappers will not be encouraged to kidnap even more? Okay, so according to the second opinion, which is that we're not allowing people to, now, according to both of these opinions, there appears to be a decree in place that says I have to think about the long-term effects of my short-term actions. That it might be that there's almost nothing that stands in the way of saving a life and redeeming somebody who's been kidnapped. There's almost no other mitzvah that's more important. And yet I say I have to cap the amount of ransom that I allow the people in the society to pay, either because it's in the long run going to cause more people to be kidnapped, which makes sense, or because in the long run it's going to spell financial ruin to the society, which is also a fascinating idea. In either case, the longer term needs of the society are being looked at and are being prioritized over short-term requirements to save an individual life. So I think this is probably the best example here of the sources that we brought, where we see a very, very clear-cut case where it's a societal concern, there is an issue, and yet we're saying that we are permitted to be forward-thinking. We don't have to just put out fires. We can actually think about the long-term consequences of what we're doing. So if we were to apply this, now I'm not going to say, what the British government should be doing right now. But what I think this does is that this provides a very helpful paradigm in which we can start to think about some of the issues. It's possible, and I'm not saying that this is the final conclusion here, but it's possible that we could say that looked at as an individual, as a moral individual agent, whenever there are people in front of me who need help, I have to try to help as many people as humanly possible. However, if I'm looking at it from a societal perspective, it may be that may change the conversation such that there's now a new opening to suggest that there could be some moral consideration, not just to try to solve all of the most immediate problems, but rather to try to think in the long run, even if it means risking people's lives in the short run. And this, of course, is an incredibly challenging and difficult question to have. And thank God I'm not a minister in the government, because then I don't know what decision I would make. If anybody has any kind of final thoughts that they want to share, I'll open up the floor now to you.
Just on this last source, it would suggest that actually the government's initial policy of getting herd immunity was the right moral thing to do, and basically say, this will spread around society, lots of people will get it. If you are lucky and you're of an age in which you can survive it, then great, and you'll come out the other side, the economy will continue to function, and in 3-4 months we'll be dreamy. But because of pressure, whatever the societal pressure there was, they've had to change from if we're going to take this source as fact or we're going to agree with it, they've moved from the moral stance of doing what's good for the society to do what's good for present day. Don't know if I'm going to say agree, disagree, but I just think quite interesting that actually their first response does agree with this source.
Yeah, I would probably agree with you there.
Yeah, I think that was a really good point. I also think that we're seeing this weird conflict between science and morals, and it's interesting to see that. I think when the heat is really turned up, people fall back on their morals more than they fall back on the science, which I think might show why spirituality and religion and science and morals has a longer life than certain scientific theories, because people
That's
seem to be more motivated to hold on to them.
Although let's not be confused here that, you know, certainly the Jewish view is that our moral decisions should be founded on good science, right? So it could be that we have certain moral biases where people are crying out to the government, how dare you withhold you know, resources when you're letting people die, right? And that might seem to be the first initial emotive reaction. And no matter how much the government says, yes, but you don't understand, we're in the long run going to be trying to save more lives, that will never work, especially in a society of, you know, tiny little sound bites and, you know, and headlines. That's not going to be a winning strategy, even if it's technically the right thing to do. So we also have that to consider.
I guess the ironic thing with science, certainly coming from some social science, is that you can always find a data set to support your argument at the time that you want to make it. So every step of the government's response so far has been backed by science. We're at all points following the scientific advice, and the scientific advice can change because you can change your thresholds on a model, or you can rerun an experiment with a slightly different set of data points. And so the fun thing about holding science up as this, we're just going to do it based on the science, is that you can create the science as you wish.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That the concept of science as being the, you know, the objective point of view is a very difficult one, because we're the ones who are manipulating the science. So okay, so in conclusion, you know, there's a lot to think about here. The situation is never so simple as, well, let's just save more lives. And it's never just simple as, well, let's just save whoever's in front of us. There's always two sides to the story here. And I think this has ramifications for our own individual actions as well, whether it's, you know, foregoing our own comfort in order to save other people's lives, whether it's making sure that, whether it's making sure that I am taking care of my own life or death needs before the needs of other people. Both of those are very important and stark considerations that come into play when we're making moral decisions. So, so I hope that you enjoyed the sources, and certainly I really enjoyed the discussion, the debate. I wish more of those faceless names in our Zoom conversation had come to the fore, because just looking at the names there's so many impressive people who are in this Zoom conversation. I would have loved to get their perspectives on it, but you know, I'll have to wait for them to kind of privately message me and tell me what they think at the end. In any case, really appreciate everybody who was involved and who participated, and hopefully we will try to do another ethical discussion next week. So be well, everyone. Stay safe and stay sane. And let's hope this mock end of the world ends as soon as humanly possible. Take care, everyone. Have a good afternoon.